to swallow my words. I want to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is sponsored by the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions. The Washington Forum is a civic education initiative which aims not just to promote intellectual diversity here at OU, but also to provide a forum where contentious subjects can be discussed and debated in a reasonable way. Judith Miller is a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter formerly with the New York Times. She will be speaking here tonight. She's now an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor to its magazine, City Journal. Since 2008, she's been a commentator on Fox News, speaking on terrorism and international security issues, on the Middle East, on American foreign policy, and on the balance between national security and civil liberties in a post-9/11 world. Before she left the New York Times in November 2005, she spent 85 days in jail to defend a reporter's right to protect confidential sources. In that year, she received the Society of Professional Journalists' First Amendment Award for her protection of sources. Since leaving jail, she has been advocating the enactment of a federal shield law to protect the relationship between reporters and their sources and the public's right to know. And I'm particularly proud actually to be able to, this is the first for the Washington Forum to have someone who's spent time in jail. So there's always a first. Not only did she spend time in jail, she also spent 3 decades working for the New York Times, where she reported on European, North African, and Middle Eastern affairs from postings in Washington, Paris, and Cairo. And indeed, she was the first woman to be named chief of the Times' Cairo bureau, responsible for covering the Arab world. And one of the highlights of her stint with the New York Times came in 2002, when she won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism for a 2001 series on Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. In the course of her distinguished career, Judith Miller has also written 5 books, including ones on biological weapons and on Saddam Hussein and the Gulf crisis. Her latest book is The Story, A Reporter's Journey, a memoir of her time as a reporter, especially in the Middle East more recently. I hope you'll join with me in welcoming Judith Miller here to campus tonight.
Thank you very much, Professor Ingram. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that all of you took some time out from preparing for finals to come here and talk about journalism, foreign policy, American politics, and other things that I hope we're going to have a chance to talk about in a Q&A form after I finish my prepared remarks. I was actually an undergraduate for 2 years at Ohio State, so this is kind of a return for me to Ohio, where I don't get very often, but it's always good to be back here and to remember that one of our presidential contenders actually went to Ohio State. I am a journalist who I guess decided very long time ago that dead people can't write stories. And so I'm what you call a kind of cautious journalist. But even being cautious these days is kind of not enough, because journalism and the world has changed so much, and my world has changed so much, that all of the rules I learned and that I started out with no longer apply. So I don't know how much wisdom I can impart to you tonight, but I know I can talk about my experiences and what I've concluded from them. And the first thing I've concluded is that the politics that I grew up with are just unrecognizable today. On March 29th in Washington, the kind of senior gurus of my profession met to award something called the Robin Toner Award for good journalism to a worthy young journalist. Robin Toner worked in the Washington Bureau with me. She was an excellent reporter. She now has a prize named after her. She died of natural causes a few years ago. And there was an honored guest at this ceremony, and that guest was President Barack Obama. And he proceeded to tell this assembled group how important they were and how indispensable what we all did was. and that you couldn't really run a democracy without us. There must have been 200 journalists in the room, but only 2 of them pointed out in print after that event what an enormous exercise in hypocrisy the president's statements were. Because of all of my time in Washington, and I've worked on and off in Washington for 30 years, I can never remember a time outside of Richard Nixon when the press has had such a difficult relationship with the president. You wouldn't know that from what you read or what you see, but I can tell you that President Barack Obama has set the record of all presidents, and this is according to the Associated Press, for withholding and not responding to and delaying responses to FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests that are filed by journalists and citizens for information about what our government is up to. No other president has been so lax and so adverse to answering questions about what his administration is doing since Richard Nixon. He is also the president who has launched more Espionage Act investigations against journalists, including one, a colleague of mine at Fox News, for unauthorized leaks of classified information to reporters, more than all of his predecessors combined. And this act was passed in 1917. So that's a lot of presidents. He has made our lives miserable by not giving press conferences. He rarely came out until he decided he went into legacy mode to speak and explain to the American people what he was doing through the press. And finally, he just had fewer one-on-one interviews on background or on the record with reporters than any president that I can remember. And yet, President Obama gets extraordinarily good press. Why is that? It was one of the questions I was asking myself when I decided I would begin to look at what's happened to the relationship between reporters and presidents and reporters in the government after I left the New York Times, shortly after leaving jail, and thought about my experience and what I'd been through. And I had other questions as well. Why is it that when we write about presidents, we write about all kinds of things that really don't interest people, and we don't tell people, especially in this administration, very much about how the policies that are being enacted are formed, and who's paid for them, and why they're being enacted? And the reason for that, and it's easy to blame the president, but actually the fault lies with us. There are fewer and fewer of us, and that is journalists like me, who are paid to dig into those issues, because it's hard information to get. All presidents, all White Houses like to operate in secrecy. That's their MO. And it's our job to tell you what's going on behind the closed doors. And by and large, we haven't done a very good job of that. Now, it's true it's been harder with this president because he has exercised very tight discipline over his senior White House staff, but there are 500 people on the National Security Council. When it was started several decades ago, there were 6. So surely among 500 people, you should be able to find someone who can tell you why a policy in Iraq was authorized, why a decision to deploy more troops was authorized, but you can't. And it turns out because with this administration, a lot of those decisions were made by only a handful of people in a room, and there were no leaks. And that was one of the reasons why the president was so determined to crack down on leakers, because he didn't want any from his internal staff. And he has by and large succeeded in that. As a result, I can tell you that, and I read at least 4 papers a day, and I read 2 or 3 more online religiously, that I know less about the decision-making apparatus of this administration than I knew about just any other president. So presidents who like to spin has done that to a large extent today, and the press is by and large constrained by a lack of money, by a lack of people willing to give you the time to dig into these issues, and by just fewer and fewer of us. There are more and more people who call themselves journalists who have no standards, and there's not a card, there's no union card to be a journalist, so anyone can call themselves a journalist, but you're reading more and more opinion by people who may or may not know what they're talking about, and fewer facts. That too is one of the tragedies of the internet, which was another reason I decided to write my book, The Story, which is out in hardback there and is just coming out now. I've got like the first copy off the presses in paper a year after it was published. So I wanted to ask myself, what's going on with us now? Are people less informed? Do they care less? Do they think they don't have time to find out? Or is the press failing all of us? And our governments more secretive and less competent, except in keeping secrets than ever before? And that's why I wrote The Story, not to settle scores, but to examine some claims that have been made about a president who influenced my life more than I ever thought he would, and that's George W. Bush. I was in Washington when it was decided that the war in Iraq was a good idea. We didn't know about it at the time, but I knew there was going to be a war in Iraq because I'd been covering the Middle East for 3 decades. And I had been worried about something since the beginning of my time in the Middle East. In my book, The Story, I go into a little bit of background about how I became interested in being a journalist. That's less important tonight than what I want to talk about, which is what's happening to journalism and to our reporting about the most important institution we have, which is our government. And I knew, because I had first gone to Iraq in 1976, that Saddam Hussein was probably one of the worst human beings on the planet. But there are lots of bad people in the world, and I'm kind of a conservative by nature about some things, certainly about the deployment of American forces overseas. So I didn't think that we had an obligation to take on all of them. But I was also a reporter who had been covering militant Islam since the late 1970s. One of the first important people I ever interviewed was Anwar Sadat of Egypt, the bravest, most enlightened leader I have ever met. And it was astonishing to me when those who were watching television at the time, saw him shot by a group of people who were wearing military uniforms and claiming to be acting in the name of their God. I think that was the moment when I became interested in this phenomenon, which then didn't even have a name, which we now call Islamism, militant Islam, fundamentalism, a term I don't like, but that's neither here nor there. And so when the editor of the New York Times asked me to go to Cairo to cover this phenomenon, which was the rise of militant Islam, it was the early 80s, I said, you know, Abe, that was the executive editor's name, Abe Rosenthal, I said, you shouldn't send me, because I'm a woman. And this was kind of odd, because I'd gotten my job at the New York Times because I was a woman, because they were hunting for women, because the women of the New York Times had sued the paper for discrimination. And people like me were getting a chance to be hired for the first time. I said, you shouldn't send me, because with the rise of militant Islam, there are going to be lots of places I can't go, lots of people who won't see me because I'm a woman, because they won't think I'm important. And he said, well, that's what I want you to write about. What is it like to be a woman and someone who's Jewish in the Middle East at this time? So I went to Cairo, which was a city I knew well, because since graduate school I had been making trips on my own and writing freelance articles about the Middle East, and suddenly I was representing the most influential paper in America in the most important bureau, which is responsible for covering 17 Arab countries. And I had been there about 1 month when we got a call that there had been a terrible explosion in Beirut, and that they thought that it was aimed at a Marine compound base where UN peacekeepers were being held, had been living, and that there were over 350 Americans there. And I basically traveled all night to get to Lebanon from Cairo, and I came across my first suicide bombing. This was the Marine compound bombing in Beirut, Lebanon. 241 Marines died that day. And I remember being kind of both exhausted and also having driven all night, nervous about what I saw, because this huge building, something, the room where we're now sitting, think of it 5 times this size, was just crumbling. There were pieces of it standing up, but you could see that anyone inside that building, if they hadn't been killed by the explosion, had probably died because of falling concrete. And in any other city, in any other part of the world, there would be a yellow tape and a crime scene, you know, the way you see on CSI. Not in Lebanon. It was complete chaos, and everyone was scrounging around the ruins of this concrete looking for things, people, memorabilia. And I picked up a helmet that had belonged to a Marine, and another soldier who was also looking through the rubble came up to me and took the helmet and said, "This was my best friend's." And of course he was buried in the rubble. So I had to write a story that day, and it was the first time I had ever had to describe what it's like to see your countrymen in bits and pieces all over the ground. But what I remembered from that day, apart from the horror of it, was that I had interviewed a Marine compound guard who had seen the yellow Mercedes truck that was loaded with explosives drive through the compound, just barrel ass his way through the compound. And I asked the Marine what he remembered about the driver, because we were all very curious about who had done this. And he said he didn't remember. He remembered that it was a man, a young man. He had a beard. He said, but there's one thing I'll never forget. He said, the driver was smiling. And I thought, what an amazing thing that someone who was driving to his death and was going to take as many Americans with him as he could was smiling. And I didn't understand why. And that led to my first book on militant Islam and the rise of militant Islam. Everywhere I went in the Middle East, I began to interview these groups, meet with some of the leaders, because you could do that in those days. And lo and behold, even though I was a correspondent from the Jewish New York newspaper of the hated, satanic United States, they were very eager to see us in those days because they wanted to get out their message. And their message was very clear. If you like Beirut, get used to it, because there's going to be a lot of it. And we will not stop until the entire world is Islamic, as they defined it, which was a complete perversion of the religion. And we will take you with us if you try and stop us. A lot of people discounted militant Islam in those days. I did not, because I saw too many suicide bombings like that. Some of them were less well covered. In Kuwait, in Cairo, people were assassinated. People who stood against them were hanged. I went to a hanging in Khartoum of an intellectual who was 87 years old. And everywhere I went, I saw the same fervor and the same absolute certainty among the people I was talking to and interviewing that not only they were right and that their interpretation of their faith was right, but that they would prevail because we would never stop them. And if we tried, we would be killed along with all of the other infidels and kafirs of the universe until the entire world was Islamic green. The book I wrote in 1996 was called God Has 99 Names, Reporting from a Militant Middle East, because in Islam, God has 100 names, but one of them is not known. One God, but many names. And what I wanted to tell my fellow readers and Americans at that point was that it was dangerous to make conclusions about this trend because militant Islam was so different in each country. But that the one thing I did know was that people who were decent and civilized of all faiths or no faith had an obligation to fight it, if only for our own self-preservation, because these people would not stop. This was not a popular point of view in the mid-90s, but it became a consensus on September 11th. And 9/11, the country got the kind of wake-up call that I'd hoped, but had always feared, we were destined to get, which was, of course, wherever you were, you probably remember the pictures of the Twin Towers. As luck would have it, I was home in New York. I live about 10 blocks from the World Trade Center. I had spent the last year writing about a group called Al-Qaeda and its mysterious leader, Osama bin Laden. In my own book, which was published in 1996, he was so unimportant that he only got 2 or 3 mentions. But by 2001, he was the militant Islamic universe. And he had money and determination to spread his faith, just as the people that I was interviewing for the past 20 years had told me they were going to do. And the New York Times ran in January 2001, that's 9 months before September 11th, a 3-part series that I and colleagues had done about bin Laden, how he financed his movement, how they were organized. I had written about the fact that they were training on chemical weapons and to use them, that they had set up a factory in Kandahar where they were beginning to experiment with germs. I had been writing a lot before that about biological weapons because real men in the military tended to worry about nukes, but I tended to worry about germs because I saw biological weapons as a really effective, efficient killer. And Osama bin Laden saw that as well. And had he not taken down the trade towers, I'm convinced that he would have continued working on chemical and biological weapons until he could have done something equally dramatic and spectacular in our country. Anyway, this series ran. It was filled with information, including satellite photos. I had gone to Afghanistan as a guest of the Taliban. That was weird. Because they had said they didn't have training camps and they weren't hiding Al-Qaeda people, and this was ridiculous. So I went with a list of camps I wanted to visit, and you can imagine. Well, let me put it this way. The pleasure of my company was no longer requested in Afghanistan after a very short time. And I had written about all of this and interviewed people who were jihadis being held by the people who opposed the Taliban. And everybody, we were feeling so great about this series. And the next day, because it was loaded with news, I didn't get one call. No interest whatsoever, except from the 10 people in government who were as worried, if not more worried than I was, about bin Laden and how to stop him. Well, we all know what's happened since 9/11. It has been an extraordinary decade and a half for our country. And we made some mistakes in how we've decided to fight militant Islam. But the 9/11 attacks were the kind of wake-up call that no country can ignore if it wants to stay alive. And President George Bush, for all of his faults, understood that message better than anybody, because he was getting the daily briefings at that point from the CIA about all of the other plans and plots around the world aimed at Americans and at Westerners, and he had the obligation to keep the country safe. And I think that whatever we now think today about George Bush, we should keep that context in mind. President Bush did what he did, and I highly recommend his autobiography, which many of my colleagues slammed, but I think it's very, very revealing about why he invaded Iraq, why he thought he needed to go into Afghanistan and clear out al-Qaeda and take out the Taliban, and I think he was right. And it's easy in retrospect to say, oh, but so many mistakes were made. It's true, many, many mistakes were made, and I know about those mistakes because I made my own share of them. The year before the Iraq invasion, I had written a lot about Saddam Hussein's chemical and biological weapons arsenal and research activities. And I had done that not because I was being fed information from the White House, but because I had been covering this for 20 years. And I had been interviewing scientists who were worried about what was going on. I had worked closely with United Nations officials who believed absolutely that Saddam was still conducting chemical experiments and still trying to get a nuclear weapon and still skirting the UN sanctions that had been set up to stop him from doing that. In fact, I never talked to a senior American official about these programs. I was dealing more or less with the people I had always talked to, analysts and people who were covert agents paid to figure out what was going on. But I had also traveled a lot in the region, and I can tell you there was not a Middle Eastern intelligence service, including the Iranians and the Israelis, who did not believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. So when I decided that I had to cover this war, I applied to the Pentagon to be embedded in the unit that was hunting for WMD in Iraq when we invaded the country. And they said, no, this is top secret, you can't do this. But eventually, I'm rather persistent when I want to be. I kind of wore them down, and I got assigned to this top secret unit. I was the only journalist to do so. And I spent a rather long amount of time in Iraq, about 4 months, hunting for WMD. Talk about a mission impossible. And my editors, I had a big Thuraya giant satellite phone because we had no communications with New York. And every now and then they would call and they'd say, find anything yet? And I'd say, no. In fact, when I went on this mission, on this assignment for my newspaper, for the Times, to report on the discovery of WMD in Iraq, my husband asked me, how long are you going to be gone? And I said, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Don't be silly, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. 4 months later, we were still on the ground hunting for what would only be found 4 years later. And even then in bits and pieces, because when you hear that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that's not true. In September 2015, the New York Times finally got around to reporting that there were bits and pieces of chemical weapons that had been hidden or buried that were turning up and were making both Americans and Iraqis sick, and in some cases even killing them. These were the weapons, not the weapons we had, quote, gone to war over, because we were all worried about a more sophisticated generation of WMD, but these were weapons that killed. And these were weapons that Saddam was not supposed to have and that he had sworn on stacks of Qurans that he had destroyed and hadn't. Nevertheless, it's true that every intelligence agency, and as a result, my reporting too, because I was talking to them, led the nation to believe that there was WMD in Iraq. And when I came back from Iraq, June of 2003, I was stunned by this meme that was beginning to gather steam. They lied, people died. This was a bumper sticker that helped elect Barack Obama, helped Barack Obama take the nomination away from the then frontrunner Hillary Clinton, because one of his charges was the president had lied about WMD. Well, there were 3 independent investigations, one by a Senate Intelligence Committee, one by a bipartisan, nonpartisan outside group of experts, and one by the internal, a huge 7-year study by the CIA itself, led by a friend of mine, Charles Delfer. A fantastic report, all of which concluded that the CIA and the 16 other US intelligence agencies and the German, French, Swiss, Russian, Iranian, and Israeli intelligence services had all gotten it wrong, but no one had lied. That we were not lied into a war because of WMD. And yet I was horrified to see that many, many Americans believed that we had been. That President Bush and his entourage knew that there was no WMD in Iraq, but he deliberately misled the country, misled people like me to believe that there were. That could not be further from the truth. But unlike other lies, about alleged lies, that had been printed and broadcast in the past, this one took root. And it took root in part because a lot of journalists wanted to believe it and wanted to see the first black president of the United States. And it was convenient, very convenient, to blame a lie for a war rather than something that to me was far more worrisome, which is 16 intelligence agencies paid billions of dollars a year getting it wrong. Because if you don't understand what you've done wrong, you're not going to get it right the next time. And I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that the very same people, a lot of them, who gave us the last set of assessments of what countries have in the way of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons, are still doing those assessments, and that by and large, not a lot has changed in the way in which we collect this kind of information. In their defense, this is really tough work. I mean, people like Saddam Hussein, they don't only deny a FOIA, they kill you if you try and publish or leak or talk about this information. It's really hard to get. But that's what we pay intelligence agencies to do. And the nation deserved better than what it got. But spinning and exaggerating intelligence is not the same as lying about it. And I never for a moment have believed that George Bush, whom I have never met to this day and never interviewed, lied this country into war. I think we all conveniently forget what the mood was like, what the concerns were, and what the determination of a president was to prevent the next 9/11 and the next WMD 9/11. Which brings me to our current subject and our current challenge, the Islamic State. Now, many people will tell you that if we hadn't invaded Iraq, there would be no Islamic State. That is not true. There were militant Islamists whom I covered since Anwar Sadat was shot. They have been there within the Islamic tent ever since the religion was created in the 7th century. There has always been tension over whose interpretation of Islam is correct. And every now and then, at different points in Islamic history, you have had these eruptions of militancy. This is one of the largest, the most ferocious we've ever seen. And it's ferocious in part because of the social media that we all look at and read, and people all over the world are following. They spread their message in a way that was inconceivable in the era of Mohammed. And as a result, the ISIS of today is the greatest challenge we've ever faced. And my nightmare is the same today as it was when I first stood in that concrete rubble in Beirut. One day, this may be a chemical bomb in New York, or a nuclear weapon in a briefcase, and it's possible today in Ohio. Or a biological attack in the Mall of America. Because make no mistake, these people are intent on doing exactly that, and they will not stop unless we stop them. So the question emerges, how do we stop them? Well, we've tried lots of different things. We began by trying to take out a non-religious dictator who seemed intent on getting WMD, Saddam Hussein, as I said, one of the most brutal, repressive people I've ever covered. But now we have an even greater threat, which is an Islamic movement which has taken root in 9 different states, in an Arab world and a Muslim world whose borders and very state essences are being challenged not only by militant Islam, but by their abject failure to satisfy the needs of their people. I've covered the Middle East for a long time, but I never thought I would see a day when 4 states no longer existed as we know them. Syria is gone. Forget about it. It's not coming back in any recognizable way, shape, or form. Libya has a shot, but at the moment it's in total anarchy and chaos. Too dangerous for people like me to go there, especially people like me. If you're on television, when I was a print journalist, I could go to these places because no one knew who I was, because I was a woman, and I could hide behind a scarf, a hijab, and a baya, a chador. But today I'm on TV, and people know what I look like. So it's too dangerous for me to go to these places. Tunisia, hanging on. That's the most successful of the Arab states that have experienced a revolution. And Egypt, the country I know the best, which has now had not 1 but 2 revolutions. First, they had an Islamic, they voted in an Islamist as their leader. That lasted 1 year before people said, wait a minute, this guy is stealing our country, we don't want this, and they got rid of him. But Egypt has many, many, many problems. Egypt, at least, is a coherent state. Yemen no longer exists. Syria, Algeria is fighting for survival. Only the military holds it together, and a lot of natural gas. Sudan, an African country split in 2. Susan Rice's greatest accomplishment, she said, where 50,000 people have now been killed in a vicious civil war that no one is covering. So the Middle East that I knew and that I covered doesn't exist anymore, and it may not exist. So how do you stop an ISIS from taking root if there's no government at all and there's total anarchy? Someone has to step in and restore order. And I'm sorry to say that in some cases, not all, but in some cases that has to be the United States and its European allies, because we're the only one with the military ability to do so. On the other hand, we cannot do what they will not do for themselves. Every time I see Syrian refugees, women and children coming across the Mediterranean, my heart breaks. Every time I see a 17 or 18-year-old boy, and most of them, 60 to 70% of them, are young men, I say, why aren't you back there fighting for your country? Why are you asking Americans and Brits and Frenchmen to go over, and women, to go over there and fight for your country if you won't? So on one hand, we need to do more. On the other hand, we cannot do it for them. Arabs must decide what kind of Islam they want and what kind of countries they want, and whether or not they want to have a country. And so to a certain extent, I think the presidential candidates we've been listening to and hearing from are right and wrong. Yes, American leadership is indispensable. Yes, Barack Obama has not done enough, and forever in his legacy will be 400,000 Syrian dead civilians. 400,000. 4 million displaced. Can you imagine what the American press would have said if George Bush had let this happen? So there's limited options available to us. What we can do and have done is deploy our special forces. Not enough, and not creatively enough, and not for a long enough time, though Lord knows those men and women have lifted more than their share of this burden. But ultimately, I believe we have to send in more forces, and we will send them in at some point. Not immediately and not everywhere, but places where we can make a difference and where we can stop anarchy from prevailing in the Islamic State, which now has roots in 9 countries, from spreading its message of hate and vengeance and beheadings and anti-Christian fervor. But this is going to be a generational war. It's going to be the war you inherit. It's not one you have a choice in fighting, because your enemy will not stop. I wrote the story to look at what I've done wrong in journalism. I wrote the story to talk about what's happened to journalism. The fact that it's too dangerous for a lot of people like me to bring the stories that we used to bring to you. We're now all relying on the Twitters and the Facebooks and social media reporters on the ground in those countries, and young people who want to be journalists who actually shouldn't be there because they don't know what they're doing often and are risking themselves and the servicemen and women who have to save them if they get captured. But this is how the news is getting out. It's not satisfactory, especially not in a world where there's a greater need for reliable information from reliable sources than ever before, but it's all we have. I'm hoping that, if anything, and I hope that journalism schools will buy this book, you'll see what it's like to try and balance the needs of great journalistic institutions against the pressures of social media that now measure quality in terms of clicks, that now determine whether or not a local newspaper or a college newspaper survives, depending on how much advertising it can sell. This is a world with more information than ever before and fewer facts than ever before on which to base our opinions. You're getting more opinion than you've ever gotten before, undifferentiated, uncertain of its origin or its credibility. The old school journalists, mainstream journalists, we've all made our share of mistakes. But the one thing we always were dedicated to was correcting them, telling you when we got it wrong, putting a correction on a front page of a newspaper or addending it to every story that's online. Most of social media never does that. And that's how lies like "they lied, people died" are perpetuated, because no one with any credibility will take them on. That's why I wrote the story. I hope you'll read it, and I hope that we can have a conversation about some of the things you've heard. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be with you. I wish you well and finals and whatever year you're in, and I welcome your questions and thoughts. Thank you. Now, Robert, since you know this group, do you want to? Okay.
You don't want to ask 2 questions. You started off by talking about how President Obama mentioned, President Obama doesn't release information to journalism. And so is it specifically Fox News? And if so, maybe that is, maybe he doesn't do that because Fox News reports such negativity towards it. And my second question is, you say that ISIS is a pretty big threat. However, I've traveled to Beirut, Lebanon as well, and my question is, why is it like Hezbollah and the Lebanese army is able to keep them out of their country and their borders if they're so powerful?
I'll just repeat the questions in case some of you didn't hear them. One is it that President Obama doesn't talk to Fox News because so many of my colleagues at Fox are critical and against him, critical of him? That's question number one, and I'll take that first. No, he doesn't talk to the mainstream media. There was a report by the leading journalist organization in Washington about a year ago saying that he had the worst record of any president ever of having press conferences where you just ask, or everyone, mainstream media. When he finally began meeting with the press, he met with people, almost as an insult, he met with people who were not mainstream media. It wasn't just that he wasn't meeting with Fox News, he wasn't meeting with CNN. He was meeting, I've forgotten the name of the guy who sits between the two plants. He does that kind of social internet thing. He was meeting with him. He did late night talk shows, but he would not sit down with reporters because we ask tough, difficult, sometimes nasty questions. That is our function. It is not to be loved. In fact, if you're loved as a journalist, you're doing something wrong. So if it were just Fox, I'd say, okay, the president has a right to not talk to Fox News, but it's everybody. And he's gotten away with it because, in general, he gets a very good press for reasons that completely escape me. Fox, by the way, I'm not talking about the nighttime, which is our view of entertainment, nighttime commentary, but the news organization itself as such, where I tend to appear, is very straight, very, pretty predictable, and very dedicated to telling you things you needed to know. Like the email scandal, Fox News helped break. And you've now got an FBI investigation of 4 different sets of activities by Hillary Clinton. We'll find out very soon what's gonna happen to that. But presidents, we're annoying, but we're the only channel he really has, a president has, unless he wants to do it himself, which is the other thing he did. He set up a White House distribution network and began to get their own photographers in and keep mainstream photographers out because they may take an unflattering photo. And once again, the White House Photographers Association had to complain about that they were getting no access to the family, not even to the dogs of the family. How do you take a bad picture of a dog? So, presidents don't want to deal with us, but it's our job to force them, and it's your job to put the pressure on to get them to do so. Now, of course, the president finally gave an interview to Chris Wallace of Fox News. My own suspicion is he did it because he knows that his nominee for the Supreme Court is not even getting a hearing from Republicans. I think, by the way, I oppose that. I think the Senate ought to make a judgment on this nominee, and I think this nominee is an extraordinarily capable man, but that's not my call. It's the Senate's, and they're not doing their job. But I think he wanted to talk to Fox News viewers to put pressure on Republicans to give his nominee a hearing. Otherwise, I don't think he would have done it. Your second question, if in countries like Lebanon, Hezbollah can keep ISIS out, is ISIS really so strong? Can't they be defeated? I remember the president the other day, and when he was talking to Chris Wallace, said, hey, come on, ISIS is a terrible threat, but it's not 10 feet tall. It's not a strategic threat to this country. More people are killed, and he said this, in bathtubs than by terrorist attacks. Well, there's a difference. The bathtub isn't trying to kill us. And I totally disagree with the president. Yes, this is not World War II. This is not armies marching and mobilized to declare war on the United States, but it's more insidious. It's a more dangerous threat, and my one nightmare remains this nexus. Someday, some way, one of these groups is going to get the kind of weapon that can kill not thousands, as we lost in New York and the Pentagon, but hundreds of thousands. And that's the day that we have to prevent, and that's the day after when people will say, why did we do so little about this organization? because I think it misjudges them. It doesn't take them seriously enough. Hezbollah keeps them out because Hezbollah is the Shia side of them. The man, thank you for this segue, this man who drove that yellow Mercedes truck through the gates of the compound was the first suicide bomber from Hezbollah. Hezbollah has killed more Americans than Al-Qaeda. But they are working for the Iranians. They are funded by the Iranians. They target Americans when we get too close to Iran or to their interests in Lebanon. Yes, they can keep ISIS out, but they perpetuate hell inside that country, and they are responsible for the flight of Christians and other minorities, non-Muslim minorities, out of Lebanon, which has been Christian since the day it was founded. So there are different levels of threats, but I don't think, look, we are much safer today than when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. We don't have the level of kind of nuclear megapower that we had then, where our nuclear arsenals are way down, the nuclear material that's stored, and this I do give credit to President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama. The nuclear materials that can make a bomb are much better stored and secured today than they were when President Obama became president. He has continued that trend, but the technology is racing ahead so fast. Genetically modified germs that can spread disease in a way that was unimaginable, even 10 years ago when I wrote Germs, my book about biological warfare. Today we can do things in a laboratory that scare the bejesus out of me. And we don't have antidotes and we don't have vaccines for these things, which is why you're not reading about it. But the enemies know about this, and they have these programs, and they will not stop. So that's my concern. Yes, back there.
You mentioned both the Iraq War and briefly 2001, September 11th. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I was really young back then, and most of us here were. But Osama bin Laden was responsible for the attacks on 9/11, so why did we lose sight of that goal so quickly? That's to invade Iraq in 2003.
I think the feeling at that point, and I have, it's interesting, I haven't really heard it expressed this way as crudely as I'm going to express it, but the war in Afghanistan went so well so fast, and so few Americans died, and so few Afghans died. By and large, we were well received. People couldn't wait to get rid of the Taliban. Taliban were real killjoys. I mean, you didn't no music, no alcohol, no tobacco, have to wear your clothes a certain way, women can't go out. It was a real pain. So they were delighted to get rid of them. But once again, extremists bury in, they dig in, they wait for their moment, and then when a government is perceived as weak or corrupt, they strike. And I think the Bush administration didn't understand how difficult it would be to permanently dislodge them. It was feeling very good. And it was also worried about this nexus between WMD and terror. And it said it's not good enough to take out a bunch of peasant farmers, the Taliban, militant Islamists who were poor and didn't have sophisticated weapons. We need to set an example to any state leader that's thinking about acquiring these weapons. What better case than Iraq? 17 UN violations, 14 of which were targeted at his WMD activity. UN resolution authorizing the use of force, an American Senate resolution, congressional resolution authorizing the use of force. This was meant to be, in Don Rumsfeld's terms, a quick and easy object lesson for any dictator who was thinking about WMD. Didn't work out that way, did it? And I was there when the war began to go south, and I watched the decisions that were made. But I think that you also had an administration that didn't have a strategy for what to do after the invasion. They assumed it would be over quickly, that we would leave quickly. That was Don Rumsfeld's assumption. But the other man who appointed himself viceroy with George Bush's blessing said, no, we need a 2-year occupation. And I was in Baghdad that day when he dissolved the Iraqi army, and he said, all of you Baathists can go home. Well, that was the entire government. So who was going to keep order? And because this was going to be lean and mean and we were going to be in and out, we couldn't do it because we didn't have the manpower, person power on the ground to do it. And the war bogged down, and the result was a catastrophe for U.S. interests. I can openly admit that. Horrible, horrible decision. The conduct of the war, not the decision to oust Saddam. Because I think the message did get through, and weirdly enough, the next story I was covering after the Iraq War, and I came back and kind of brushed the sawdust off of everything, was Libya's decision to give up WMD. Why? Because the mad colonel said, oh my God, we're next. If he invaded Iraq, I got to get rid of this nuclear stuff. And he did. And then, of course, President Obama said, this is the one man we're going to take out. The one Middle Eastern dictator, and they're all pretty bad, one Middle Eastern dictator who had given up WMD gets invaded by the United States and its NATO allies. Not good if your major goal is non-proliferation of WMD. So mistakes are not limited to the Bush administration. Lots of administrations make them. What's unforgivable about this one is that it contradicted the decision to move against Gaddafi, whom I had covered for 20 years, and I have to tell you, he was mad as a hatter. He was completely nutso. But he did the right thing when it came to WMD. And the lesson that every other tin horn dictator in the region said was, aha, he gave up WMD, and look at what happened to him. We are not going to do the same. The message that Barack Obama did not want delivered was heard loud and clear in North Korea, which we're dealing with now. Next challenge, your guys' challenge. Any other questions? Yes.
What do you think is the role or responsibility that journalists have for spreading false information about WMDs and failing to track down the truth?
Well, I did track down the truth, which is here. And I talk about some of the people who were sources whom I couldn't talk about at the time. I went to jail to protect a source. You cannot do the kind of reporting I do on the nation's most sensitive secrets unless people trust you, and they won't trust you unless you're willing to go to jail. And I'm the last reporter to go to jail, and I'm the first one in a long time. So the first thing you have an obligation to do is when you make a mistake, acknowledge it. And that's what I do in the story. I talk about why I made some analytical mistakes. You know, I just assumed that Saddam would show the world that he had given up WMD if in fact he had. I didn't think he would keep his country under permanent sanction and have 100,000 people in his own country, in an oil-rich country, die of malnutrition and starvation if he weren't hiding something. It's a logical mistake, but I didn't have access to the raw information. I'm not sitting there looking at intelligence reports. I'm talking to the people who do that. So the idea that the journalists should have said, oh, no, I disagree with 16 US intelligence agencies who told the president, not just told him, but with high confidence that Saddam still had chemical and biological weapons. A high confidence ruling is like you and I are all sitting here and we all see that there's a kind of, circle up here. That's high confidence. So what was George Bush supposed to say, or a journalist supposed to say? And, I remember that wonderful moment, I'm sure some of you do too, when the president was given a presentation, he was given an advance look at what we were going to present at the UN to convince the world that Saddam had WMD, which was not hard because all the rest of the world believed it too. And at the end of the presentation, he said, gee, guys, I mean, you say you got all this overwhelming evidence. Is this the best you can do in terms of presenting stuff publicly? And his CIA director, George Tenet, says, Mr. President, slam dunk. Don't worry about it. So who are you going to believe? I mean, I'm certain, even though I've never met him and interviewed him, that George Bush believed it and that he was more upset than anyone else when he found out that we were wrong. But being wrong is not the same as lying. And that's a big leap. And it's a leap that people make for political ends when they want to be elected president or when they want the world to lose faith in conservative values or when they want Republicans to be discredited. But you don't do that when it comes to lessons as important as what we've learned from WMD. And it's really the reason I wrote this book, to look at what I did wrong and look at what people did with these honest mistakes. And everybody's going to make mistakes in intelligence. It's too hard to get right. But to use it politically for your narrow political ends is a different kind of sin in my book. So we have an obligation to correct mistakes as soon as we make them, and to try not to repeat the same ones again, so that we can go on making new ones. Yes?
Let me ask the question in a slightly different way. Say, you have a heightened sense or a keen sense of the threats that are coming after based on reporting, based on TV policies and television. But in this election season, almost bipartisan, there's a reticence about and skepticism about these very problems that you're highlighting, and a willingness, really, of candidates of both parties to do the sorts of things that you're suggesting need to be done, which seems to come straight out of the experience in the Senate.
Right.
So how is it that the populace, right, the people who have to vote dollars and send their sons and daughters, are going to, how do you imagine that gap between what you and maybe others you talk to see and what most of us see? There's a very different sort of realities. How is that bridged? And isn't journalism, the way that journalism was practiced, account for a lot of that gap? Right?
Yeah, you know, journalists are held in even lower esteem than congressmen. That's pretty amazing. But as I said, our job is not to be popular. But you know how we're going to bridge this gap? An event will bridge this gap. Events will bridge this gap. People, you know, I've always tried to do it by writing what I know or what I'm afraid of. So my first book was about the Holocaust and how we have all, in different nations, distorted the facts about what happened and our responsibility and complicity in that horrendous genocide. Because we don't like to think that we're not as good as we'd like to be. Make no mistake about it, this country won the war with the former Soviet Union, whose role is often denied in this country, but more Russians died than Americans. I mean, 60 million people died in the former Soviet Union in World War II. But, you know, you have these huge events. So that was my first book. My second book was about the danger of the rise of militant Islam. My third book, which came out the day before 9/11, was on biological terror. And less than 1 month later, we had the anthrax letters, remember? 2 pats of butter killed 5 Americans and infected 17 and caused $2 billion worth of damage. I had no idea that was going to happen, but I knew it was an unrecognized threat. So I wrote about that. Now I'm writing about not learning lessons and not acknowledging mistakes and using errors and portraying them as lies. But ultimately, the only thing I think, Robert, that's going to wake us up, and I really hate to say this, but I don't want it to be the next attack, but it may very well have to be reminded that it's not just the Boston Marathon or San Bernardino or the occasional this or that, but this is going to be a steady business as usual kind of world. And we're either going to learn to live with that, as the Israelis have done, and they do an amazing job of kind of practicing counterterrorism by being so resilient. But I don't think Americans are capable of that, because we haven't had that kind of experience. We don't want that kind of experience. But the only way to kind of understand the threat and what we're up against is to experience it more immediately than we have done. I would like to think that books change that, but in my heart of hearts, I don't believe that anymore, because I've seen too many lies perpetuated. You know, I didn't want to turn this into an attack on the presidential candidates, but PolitiFact, which is pretty good, you know, they look at what candidates say, and they have Donald Trump not just with one lie or occasional lie or two lies. By the way, one of the lies he repeated was that we were lied into Iraq on WMD. The president knew there was no WMD. That was an absolute lie. And he repeated it, but in fact, PolitiFact found that 2/3 of his statements and claims are what they called pants on fire lies. And yet, he's leading the Republican roster at this moment. 37% of Americans say they support him. And it's lie after lie after lie. So what are we to conclude? That Americans don't care if they're lied to? Or if they prefer to believe what they prefer to believe and facts don't matter anymore, then it doesn't matter what journalists say, because he's found a way to communicate directly. It's not just Donald Trump. I mean, it's easy for me to beat up on him because he's a fellow New Yorker, and we do that in New York. We're not Wisconsin nice, we're New York nasty. But Ted Cruz does much the same thing. They're all lying about their numbers. Bernie Sanders, it would be a disaster for our balance sheet, our deficit. You guys will be in debt for the rest of your lives if half of his programs are practiced. The only person who's kind of not lying, and because of that she's deemed to be too boring to be president, Hillary Clinton, and she's lying about something else, I believe, which is the whole email system that she set up to skirt FOIA, to skirt scrutiny, to have a different standard. That's another kind of lie. But they only get away with it if you let them get away with it. And it's up to you to stop them. Journalists can't. We try, but you, the people, we, the people, have to really do it. Thank you very, very much.